Django is in the pen, and I aim to get him there all in one piece.
Well, I'm all broken up about that man's rights.
You should be.
You ever get that sinking feeling? You know, the one that you feel you've only heard maybe half the story? Or even a different story altogether? Hello and welcome to the Red Pill Diary. I'm Lewis, and I'll be your host. So, ready or not, let's flip the switch and shed some light on it. It was a cold winter evening as the well-dressed man sat on the wooden bench across the street from the stone house. It was 16th Street. His signals had gone unanswered, and he was perplexed as he rested from his second walk in front of her house, raising his white handkerchief 3 times. It was their signal, but he had received no response. The 8th Attorney General for the District of Columbia and the son of famous Francis Scott Key waited. As with Paolo in Dante's Alighieri's Inferno, Philip Key's undoing was the love of his own Francesca, the wrong woman, Teresa Baggioli Sickles, the daughter of the famous Italian composer Antonio Baggioli and the wife of Congressman Dan Sickles. Unlike Paolo and Francesca, he alone lay mortally wounded by 3 gunshots from 2 pistols at the hand of Congressman Dan Sickles in Lafayette Square in Washington, D.C. What followed was a trial of an extraordinary and one of the most controversial trials in the 19th century. It captured the public attention. Some asserted that Sickles' rise was due to his wife's affair with President Buchanan, a scandalous and unproven claim. He argued that he was defending his family's honor. The public was divided and watched with rapt attention. The jury deliberated and returned with its verdict in just over an hour. Not guilty. The reason? Insanity. The first use of the crime of passion in the United States. And his brilliant attorneys? One of them was Edward Stanton, who would become Secretary of War under Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. Congressman Dan Sickles would walk away a free man to serve in the Union Army as a general. He would lose a leg at Gettysburg and be awarded the Medal of Honor. But that was not the end of this story. It was February 27th, 1859. So here's where we set the backstory. And we'll start by kind of sharing some things about parties. So let's start with the Republican Party. During this period of time, the Republican Party had to start, and with the melding of the Whig Party, a newly minted party, which pretty much controlled the government for almost 3 decades, essentially from 1860 to 1886. The only exception would be when Andrew Johnson, who was a Democrat, was president after the assassination of President Lincoln. Despite its success over 3 decades, it had its bumps and troubles. It was widely successful in 1868 with the first election of Ulysses Grant. What followed, though, was a scandal-ridden Grant administration. He initially had a vice president, and you'll remember this name from the previous episode. His name was Schuyler Colfax. He was the vice president. Remember him? He was involved in a Credit Mobilier scandal with the Union Pacific. The Republicans dropped him from the ticket for obvious reasons, and they had other struggles. The Civil War was over, but the schisms remained. This whole decade was tumultuous. I mean, you had the assassination of Lincoln, you had Andrew Johnson, and those issues that went on with him, and the fighting between him and Grant. You had an overwhelming debt load for the war of $450 million worth of greenbacks, paper that they had printed during the Civil War that weren't backed by a specie, actually gold and silver. Then you had the resulting interest payments to this massive debt of $450 million plus, which obviously created economic problems like inflation, difference between the greenback and gold. How about tariff protections and a new banking system? So in addition, they had other problems between 1862 and 1865 going forward into the 1870s. The struggle with this financing of the war, the Civil War that had just ended, there was this greenbacks, which were about 430 to 450 million in circulation. But they also had these things called shin plasters. Essentially, they were fractional amounts, 20, 10, 5 cents, and they looked like postage stamps. This issue about how to continue to back that money create issues between 2 camps, hard money and the South. Generally, that division between those two was geographically between East and West, the states in the West versus the states that on the East Coast. So now you've got a division East and West, and you also have a continual fermenting of the division between the North and the South. So the icing on the cake during this period of time was the Depression, which really gets the public riled up, and the Panic of 1873. That only intensified the positions of the parties and people. So in 1874, to address this issue, Congress passed the Inflation Act of 1874 over the opposition of the hard money people in both parties. Basically, Grant vetoed it, and that incensed everybody. Does that sound familiar? Think right now. Are those things occurring today? I mean, we may not have exactly the things that was going on. Like, we don't have greenbacks, but we do have fiat currency. We don't use the gold standard, which is a problem, which was a problem then. We have enormous amount of debt, which they did, $430 million to $450 million. It's a lot of money in 1860s, 1870s. We've got trillions of dollars. They were worried about how they're going to service that debt, the interest on that, and how it was going to get paid. Well, we have the same issues going on today. We have a division between two parties. We have divisions between people and their view of how this country should be run. We have divisions galore. It's not the issue of having a division or having a discussion about something we disagree on. It's how we come to a resolution. Okay, now you're going to say, what's this got to do with 1872 and what's going on for us? Well, let's go back and talk about what happened between 1872 and 1876. So in 1872, the Republicans captured 196 with the Democrats at 83 seats, with some seats to the independents. So the Republicans had a vast majority in Congress. However, that turned around in the election of 1874, and it essentially flipped. It was one of the most stunning reversals in political history because of those things we just talked about. Democrats won 167 seats. The Republicans only had 99, with 8 anti-Republican independents winning seats. It was stormy, it was dark, and the Republicans were very concerned about its prospects, considering Grant's downturn, the scandals, and the administrative issues that were going on, the money, the Depression, the panic. You know what? And they didn't want him to run for a third term. They didn't want Grant to run again. Remember, the limitations on terms for a president didn't occur until February 27, 1951, with the 22nd Amendment. So in 1876, he could have run again and again. He could have kept running. But they didn't want him to run again. Why? Because he believed, or they believed, that the Democrats would win. And the North, or the Republicans, and there are people that considered the Democrats, especially in the South, they called them copperheads and carpetbaggers. They did not want the South to have control of the South. And if they believed that the Democrat Party was going to win, then that would mean that the South would return back to the state it was. And they just were not having it. Remember when we talked about the 1800s, the Federalists, the Anti-Federalists, the Democrat Republicans? The fact that each side was divided because they saw the trajectory of the country in distinct terms, completely opposite to some extent from each other, and they were determined to get their trajectory in place. Now, does that ring a bell? Does that sound familiar about this division and the parties not want the other party to win because they don't want them to implement what they believe to be the proper trajectory of this country? But do you ever notice it's always about the party? It's never about the trajectory of the country for the benefit of the citizen. It's about what's the best thing for the party. So we see that today. Well, guess what? It's been that way since inception, at least when the parties started to divide. Now, granted, that's a generalization, obviously, my opinion from a non-historian. What I've seen is that party loyalty is increasing. Look at what it is today. It's like a soccer team, like a rugby team. It's either my team or you're out of there. It's really elevated, especially today, but it was also then. So now let's go backwards for a brief moment and look at the outcome of the election of 1800 and what Congress did. Why? Because we're going to show what happens when these parties have these conflicts and how they resolve them when it comes to an election. And the election of 1800 will give us a framework to look at the election of 1876. The election of 1800 was contentious. The two battling out for president were, of course, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. After 36 rounds and basically some political shenanigans, it turned to Jefferson. So the Democrat-Republican Congress wanted to tweak the process. So the president and the vice president were chosen as a team, like the political buddy system. So following this event between Jefferson and Burr, Congress passed and the states ratified the 12th Amendment on June 15th, 1804. This addition, the Democrat Republicans believed, would eliminate the problem that Jefferson faced in the defeat of Aaron Burr as president, but having to deal with him as vice president, and the difficulty John Adams faced with a rival party, a Democrat-Republican, with a Federalist president when Jefferson was the vice president. So let's turn to other places where we've seen this as well. How about the 1910 and 1911 when Congress passed and the states ratified the 17th Amendment on April 8, 1913, following the 1912 election, and the Progressive parties coming to power. They changed the way the senators were elected from being appointed by the legislature to by a vote of the citizens. Let's go forward to 2020. What did the Democrat Congress do in response to the election that was contentious? It passed the Electoral College Reform Act of 2022 to, quote unquote, fix the problem for us. Right. So you see, it's not a fix for the citizen or the voter. It's a fix to stop whatever it is that they didn't want then to rehappen to them. So it's about the party. You see, it's all about them and what they don't want to happen to them, or they want to stop the other party from doing something in the future. It's not about fixing it for us to make it convenient for the voter. It's about making it strategic for the party. Okay, so you say, let's get off the soapbox and we'll go to 1876. Well, what was important about 1876? It was the Centennial year. And the Republican administration hoped that the Centennial Fair would divert the public's attention from its economic woes, the Depression and the issue about inflation and the money. And they were hopefully to bridge that divide by making people feel patriotic, therefore not having this animosity towards each other, even though they did. So the election of 1876 pitted Republican governor of Ohio, Rutherford B. Hayes, against Democrat governor of New York, Samuel J. Tilden. And the electioneering was typical of the time. And at the end, when the votes were starting to be counted, it appeared Tilden and a good government, insert moral or lack of scandal, is what the population wanted. Tilden won the popular vote in the initial vote tally, and it appeared to be leading the electoral count at 184 with only 185 needed. Tilden only required one electoral vote out of the remaining 20 still out: Oregon, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. So the Republican leadership, feeling defeated, they went home. One of the guys went home with a bottle of whiskey to await the results from the southern states and what they thought was the inevitable loss. But wait, enter you-know-who, Dan Sickles, yes, the congressman who got away with murder. Now here's where the interesting things start to occur. Enter Dan Sickles. He sees everybody's gone. So he starts looking at and calculating at the Republican headquarters the votes and the electoral count. And the leadership had already gone. His spidey senses took over and he started to strategize how he could work this out. So he kind of finagled permission to fire off a lot of telegrams on behalf of the Republican leadership, encouraging the leaders of the remaining states not to give up and to keep counting. In his mind, it wasn't over until it was over. Yet there's some shady stuff going on. Double election slips with the clerk pulling the alternative and placing it in a box if needed. Yeah, questionable printing of ballots where one person would choose the candidate based on the party brand. They'd put it on the wrong party so that the person who may not be able to read would pick whatever the party brand was and just pick that person even though it wasn't the actual person in the party. So they were being misled. Yeah, in Louisiana, they just threw out 13,000 votes for Tilden, and then they only threw out 2,000 for Hayes, well, just because they wanted to win. And then they sent the electoral certificates in. Doesn't this sound familiar? We've seen this before. It's not talking about today. This is in 1876. Well, all that didn't sit well with the other team, so the alternative set of electors was sent to Congress, meaning Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida sent two sets of conflicting electoral votes. Oh, where have I seen that before? One for each party to count in Congress. So apparently it wasn't illegal. Well, unethical, immoral, improper, put a term on it, but apparently it wasn't illegal. At this point, Tilden, the Democrat, had 184 votes, electoral votes, and Hayes had 165, with 20 votes still disputed. Tilden only needed one of those 20. So what did they do? Well, they went to the Constitution and it stipulated these electoral votes had to be directed to the president of the Senate. And who was the president of the Senate at the time? A guy named Thomas Ferry. He was a Republican. So in the electoral vote count, the Democrats and the Republicans, they had these dueling slate of electors, each disputing the vote and claiming the win. Now, the Republicans assisted the Senate president count the votes in their respective favor. There had been a rule previous to this that the Republicans had used to reject votes, but by this same process, but had backed out of that was in a bill in 1865. It was called the 22nd Joint Rule. So under the 22nd Joint Rule, Congress not only claimed the power to count, but defined that power as permitting it to reject an invalid state canvass. So when they said this was unprecedented, 1865 and 1866, they did it. And they understood it, that the president of the Senate, and they actually had done it prior to that, that could reject invalid state canvasses. And they did it to the Democrats in the past in order to continue the Republican hold during the Reconstruction in the South. Now, here's where the Democrats, their team messed up. When they took power in 1875 out of the 1874 election, they didn't take this bill up again, which would embody this rule. So guess what? The Democrat Congress got creative in January of 1877 because they couldn't use the rule like the Republicans had done. Remember we talked about team fixing it? Well, here's their fix because they couldn't use this 22nd Joint Rule. So to resolve the dispute, instead of sending it to the House, because neither had an electoral majority, the Democrats desired, as provided under the 12th Amendment. That's what they wanted to do. However, the Republicans wanted the president of the Senate, who happens to be a Republican, to determine the electors to count, which would give their candidate 185 total necessary. Louisiana, South Carolina, Florida were all Republican. Well, following the end of the Civil War, the South was kind of under a conservatorship, my definition, with Republican-appointed governors and federal troops stationed in each state as part of the Reconstruction. Yeah, big government with the standing army kind of stuff. Hamilton would be proud. With each side having their hands really in the proverbial cookie jar, a compromise, not stipulated in the Constitution, occurred. Congress passed a temporary measure called the Electoral Commission Act of 1877 on January 29th, 1877 to fix their problem. It wasn't a problem about the voting of the public. It was a problem for the party to fix this issue because each side wanted to win. So the Electoral Commission Act established this commission, and it ended up, because of one independent, it was 8-7, or 8 out of 15 were Republicans. So it was a big surprise. The commission voted 8-7 along party lines to award electoral votes to, you guessed it, Hayes. And the Democrats were up in arms. They just threatened to prevent the count of electoral votes and delay the resolution of the election with frequent adjournments and filibusters past the March 3rd deadline, triggering some other exciting shenanigans. So with that threat of delay, the Democrats had hoped to win some concessions from the Republicans, which they got. Hayes agreed to end the Reconstruction, and the Democrats agreed. So with that delay, there's two issues that they really wanted, the Democrats did, and it was restoring their control of the government in the South and removing all the federal troops, ending Reconstruction, and a federal subsidy for railroads. Shocker, UP and others would rejoice. So the Democrat Speaker of the House, realizing that creating chaos would backfire on the Democrats, they ruled the filibuster out of order and forced the completion of the count in the early hours of March 2nd, 1877, with 185 votes for Hayes and 184 for Tilden. And Hayes was declared the winner and sworn in immediately. My gut in all of this, I think, is that Tilden actually won this election, but other issues were at play behind the scenes. So it seems that when the system doesn't work accordingly to what the party would think, they basically try to circumvent it. So they circumvent it by creating a mechanism to fix the problem they saw. So each time the results do not coincide with the desired outcome, they change it. This continued circumvention and adjustment to benefit the party each and every time. It's like leapfrog. So the next time something happens, they fix it so that it won't happen to them again. So the next time you hear somebody or hear a person in the halls of Congress or a partisan sycophant decrying our right to know the particulars of their conduct and questioning or challenging them as the end of democracy, you know what it is. It's a condescending position from those that see themselves as the guardians of the galaxy or Yes, you heard me right. Who are they? Well, they're a fictional race of intelligent, rational horses, contrasted with the monstrous yahoos, members of the brutish humanoid race. That would be us. And the Hurms would be them, us basket of deplorables. So if you want to find out about the yahoos, look at Jonathan Swift's 1726 satirical novel, Gulliver's Travels. It's in his fourth voyage. So you know who the ruling class believes they are? Well, they're the Hurms. And who are we? We're the yahoos, or other pejorative titles given to the non-elite, non-ruling class. Me and you, well, maybe you too. So don't think these shenanigans won't happen again. We've seen them. 1876, 1910. We're going to get to that later on, but 1800. Don't think they won't happen. Have you been watching the machinations in real time that's going on now? Don't think for one moment that it's in your best interest or their saving democracy slogan. It isn't very likely. And when they assert they are looking for high ground to bring decency back to Washington, regardless of what side of the chasm you stand, from what I've seen in history about Washington, D.C. and consistent conduct and behavior, you have to wonder who is the most intelligent and rational in D.C. The moral high ground for them and decency are subterranean. My eyes are open. Are yours? We're not playing that game any longer. I'll leave the lights on for you. Well, we filled those pages. If you have comments, suggestions, share them. The more input, the more likely a better outcome. I'm moving forward because backwards is not an option. I've turned the lights on here, and I'll be leaving them that way. Join me next time on The Red Pill Diary.